Look, if you have $1 million IRA, you already know the age 73 required minimum distributions are coming for you. I mean, you know what a Roth conversion is. But what our source material reveals today is that the way 90% of retail investors execute these conversions is actually destroying hundreds of thousands of dollars in wealth.
Yeah, it's a massive blind spot.
Right now, as you're listening to this, there are over 800,000 Americans sitting on IRA balances of $1 million or more. 800,000 people. And every single one of them is facing the exact same mathematical reality. You spend decades of your life diligently saving, investing, maxing out contributions, and watching that tax-deferred balance grow. But at age 73, the IRS steps in and mandates that you must start withdrawing that money.
And they do not do it politely.
Mm-hmm.
The smartest financial minds, the people who actually protect multi-generational wealth, they don't view an RMD as just a standard distribution. They know it's a forced, mandatory taxable event entirely designed to extract decades of deferred revenue out of your accounts and into the Treasury.
Right, right.
I mean, the IRS has essentially been your silent partner for 40 years, letting you take all the investment risk, and now they're calling in their chips. But there's a legal, heavily vetted firewall that high net worth individuals have been using for years. It's the Roth Conversion. And our mission for this deep dive is to open the file on what we're calling the Roth Extraction.
Exactly. We have a massive stack of specialized source material here, essentially a strategic playbook detailing exactly how IRA millionaires structure these conversions to pay the absolute lowest legal tax rate. Today, we aren't talking about what good conversion is. We're talking about the advanced 5-layer mechanics of doing it without triggering IRMAA landmines or the internal payment trap. And look, I've got a confession to make right out of the gate.
Let's hear it.
Up until reading through this research, I fundamentally misunderstood how this worked in practice. I genuinely thought that executing a Roth conversion simply meant moving a chunk of money from your traditional IRA into your Roth, and, when the tax bill came due for that move, you just checked a box and paid the tax directly out of the IRA money itself.
Yeah, and you are definitely not alone in that. It's an incredibly common mindset because it feels highly logical to the everyday investor. You have the funds sitting right there in the account, so why wouldn't you use them to cover the toll charge for moving the money? You figure, I'll just let the account pay its own exit fee.
That's exactly what I thought.
But when we look at the mechanics of tax-free compounding, paying those taxes from the IRA itself is perhaps the single most destructive error you can make during a conversion. The entire premise of this deep dive is moving from a retail mindset, which reacts to taxes, to a strategic mindset, which builds a structural defense against them. We're going to build this firewall layer by layer, looking at the exact mathematics and the very specific, highly time-sensitive legislative changes that are altering the landscape for the next few years.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to start right there with my own misconception, which our source material labels the internal payment trap. So let me walk you through the exact hypothetical scenario I had in my head, the one I thought was the smart way to play the game.
Please do.
Let's imagine you have an investor who decides they want to convert $200,000 from their traditional IRA over to a Roth IRA. They know this $200,000 is going to be treated as ordinary income, so there's going to be a tax bill. Let's say the blended, effective, and marginal tax bill on that conversion is $50,000. The retail mindset, my mindset says, great, I'll just tell the brokerage to withhold $50,000 to send straight to the IRS, and I'll move the remaining $150,000 into the Roth.
Right.
It sounds incredibly convenient. You don't have to dip into your personal checking account. You don't have to liquidate any standard brokerage assets. The IRA just handles it.
It sounds clean until you run the numbers on what you actually just did to your future net worth.
Yeah.
When you execute that move, you step right into the internal payment trap. You haven't just paid a tax bill, you've permanently amputated your tax-free growth engine.
Amputated. That's a strong word.
It's an accurate word. Let's break down the specific math from the source material to see why this is so damaging over the long term. When you withheld that $50,000 and handed it over to the IRS, you permanently removed it from the Roth environment. That environment is a legally protected vault where money grows completely tax-free for the rest of your life. There is no tax drag from dividends, no capital gains taxes when you rebalance, nothing.
Okay, I follow you.
So if you had found a way to keep that $50,000 inside the conversion, and let's say you left it to grow at a standard historical return rate of 7% over the next 20 years, that $50,000 would have turned into nearly $193,000.
Wait, hold on. If I'm using $50,000 of my liquid cash from a checking or brokerage account to pay this tax instead of using the IRA, I'm losing the opportunity cost of investing that $50,000 today. Are we absolutely sure the tax-free growth in the Roth outpaces the loss of liquidity in my outside accounts? Because if I leave that 50 grand in my standard brokerage, it's going to grow too.
That's the exact right question to ask, and it's where the math gets really interesting. Yes, your $50,000 in the standard taxable brokerage account will grow, but it suffers from a constant compounding phenomenon known as tax drag.
Tax drag.
Right. In a standard brokerage account, every time a stock pays a dividend, you're taxed on it that year. Every time a mutual fund manager rebalances a portfolio and distributes a capital gain, you're taxed on it that year. If you decide to sell a position to buy something else, you trigger capital gains taxes. That tax drag acts like a constant headwind on your compound interest. Let's say that $50,000 in your taxable account also generates a 7% gross return. After federal and state taxes on dividends and capital gains over 20 years, your net annualized return might only be 5 or 5.5%.
So the outside money is growing, but it's constantly leaking value to the IRS every single year.
Yeah. Exactly. But if you use that inefficient, heavily taxed outside money to pay the conversion tax, you allow the full $200,000 to enter the Roth. Inside the Roth, there is zero tax drag. A 7% gross return is a 7% net return. Over a 20-year horizon, the difference between a tax-dragged 5% return and a tax-free 7% return on a large principal balance is massive.
Wow.
By taking the convenient route and paying the tax from the IRA, you didn't just pay a $50,000 tax bill today. You surrendered the spread between taxable and tax-free compounding on that money for the rest of your life.
Wow.
You lost the original $50,000 plus the nearly $150,000 in compounding interest that it would have generated tax-free.
So a nearly $200,000 swing in net worth gone simply because I chose the convenient checkbox on the brokerage transfer form. I wasn't viewing the $50,000 as a seed that was going to grow into an orchard. I was just viewing it as a sunk cost, a fee I had to pay to get through the door.
What's fascinating here is that the IRS system is actually optimized to seamlessly facilitate this exact mistake.
Are you serious?
Oh, absolutely. The distribution forms make it incredibly easy to just click a box and have the taxes withheld automatically. The government understands the time value of money and tax-free compounding far better than the average retail investor does. They are more than happy to take your $50,000 today because they know it permanently shrinks the pool of tax-free capital they'll never be able to touch again in the future. By falling into the internal payment trap, you're voluntarily surrendering the most powerful wealth-building tool in existence.
You never see the money you lost because it simply never gets the chance to exist. That is brutal. But let's move to a tax that is very visible and, frankly, catches retirees completely off guard, because the internal payment trap is just the first mistake in our source material. The second major mistake revolves around the psychology of the retail investor. Let's talk about the emotional urge to just get it over with.
The panic conversion.
Exactly. You look at your traditional IRA, you see $1 million, and you know the RMD mandate is looming. You read the news, you suspect marginal tax rates are going to go up in the future. So the emotional reaction is to panic. You think, I'm just going to convert a huge chunk right now. I'll rip the Band-Aid off, pay the 32% marginal rate, and never have to worry about the IRS again. Especially for retirees who might already be collecting a pension and Social Security, they feel they have the cash flow to handle a big one-time tax hit.
That emotional reaction, that desire to just rip the Band-Aid off, is exactly what triggers the second landmine in our playbook. When you execute what the source material calls a panic conversion, you aren't just pushing yourself into a higher standard federal income tax bracket. You're triggering secondary systems tied to your adjusted gross income. If you take a massive $200,000 conversion and stack it directly on top of your existing base income, you trigger a stealth surcharge known as IRMAA.
IRMAA Day. Let's spell that out for the listener, because I guarantee a lot of people have never heard this acronym until it's too late. Income-related monthly adjustment amount. And this isn't a tax you pay on your 1040 on April 15th.
No, it's not an income tax in the traditional sense. It's a stealth surcharge applied directly to your Medicare Part B and Part D premiums. To understand how dangerous this is, we have to look at how the government calculates your exposure. They use a specific metric called MGI, or Modified Adjusted Gross Income. Now, most people know their adjusted gross income. It's the bottom line on the first page of your standard tax return. But MGI requires you to take your adjusted gross income and add back certain deductions and exclusions. For retirees, the most common add back is tax-exempt municipal bond interest.
Ah, so if you've been buying municipal bonds your whole life thinking the interest is completely tax-free and invisible to the IRS, it actually gets pulled right back into the math when they're calculating whether to hit you with this Medicare surcharge.
Exactly. So your base MGI is already higher than you might think. Now, you take that panic conversion, say $200,000, and you dump it directly into your MGI. The Medicare system has very strict, rigid income tiers. Let's look at the specific threshold numbers. For a married couple filing jointly, the base tier for standard Medicare premiums right now allows for a MGI up to around $206,000. If your base income plus your massive Roth conversion pushes your MGI to $206,001, you cross the threshold. You don't just pay a little bit more, you trigger the first IRMAA penalty tier. And there are several tiers, stepping up at roughly $258,000, $322,000, and so on.
And the most dangerous aspect of IRMAA, according to the research, is the mechanism of how it's actually applied to your premiums. There's a strict 2-year delay.
A 2-year look-back mechanism. The Medicare system uses your MAGI from your tax return from 2 years prior to determine your premiums today. So you do the massive panic conversion this year, you file your taxes next April, you pay the higher ordinary income tax, and you think you navigated the waters successfully. Year 1 goes by, and your Medicare premiums are normal, you feel great about your decision.
Right, you think you're in the clear.
But exactly 24 months after you executed that poorly timed panic conversion, the system catches up. You go to the mailbox, and you find a notice from the Social Security Administration stating that because your income spiked drastically 2 years ago, you've triggered the higher tiers of the IRMAA surcharge.
And what does that actually look like in dollars and cents? Let's use a real anonymized client scenario from the source data to ground this.
Let's look at a couple from the case studies who sold a small commercial property and decided to also execute a $150,000 Roth conversion in the exact same tax year, thinking they'd just take all their tax hits at once. Their combined MAGI skyrocketed past the $322,000 threshold. 2 years later, they received their notice. Their Medicare Part B premiums jumped from the standard base rate of roughly $174 a month to over $450 a month per person. Their Part D prescription drug coverage premiums also saw a massive IRMAA surcharge added on top.
So we're talking about a combined spike of over $800 a month just in unexpected Medicare premiums for the household.
It equated to an unexpected spike of nearly $12,000 for the year. $12,000 of after-tax money suddenly demanded from a retiree who was likely living on a fixed monthly budget, arriving as a complete shock 24 months after the fact. It's a cash flow disruption that forces people to pull more money out of their remaining accounts just to pay the government, triggering more taxes. It's a vicious cycle.
So what does this all mean? We've established that the retail mindset is basically walking through a minefield blindfolded. You pay the tax out of the IRA, you destroy $150,000 in tax-free compound interest, you panic and convert too much at once without calculating NGI, you get hit with a $12,000 stealth Medicare tax 2 years later. We've properly defined the threat. Now, I want to pivot away from the mistakes. We promised the listener the exact firewall the wealthy use. How do high net worth strategists actually execute these conversions? Because they obviously aren't taking these hits.
They absolutely aren't, because they don't rely on emotion or convenience. They rely entirely on structural planning and strict mathematical discipline. This brings us to the strategist's 5-layer playbook, starting with layer 1, which is bracket maximization. The foundational rule here is that you never convert based on a gut feeling, and you never convert an arbitrary round number. You convert based strictly on the mathematical capacity of your current marginal tax bracket.
Let's really break down the difference between marginal and effective tax rates, because I think a lot of people hear 24% tax bracket and assume their entire income is taxed at 24%.
That's a crucial distinction. The U.S. uses a progressive marginal tax system. Think of the tax brackets as a series of distinct containers. The first chunk of your income fills the 10% container. Once that's full, the next chunk overflows into the 12% container, then the 22%, and so on. Your effective tax rate is the blended average of all those containers. But your marginal tax rate is the rate applied to the very last dollar you earned, the highest container your income reached. When we talk about bracket maximization, we are laser focused on the marginal rate.
Because every dollar you pull out of a traditional IRA for a conversion sits right on top of your existing base income. It's the last money in, so it's taxed at your highest marginal rate.
Precisely. Let's say we calculate your base income, your Social Security, your pension, any part-time consulting income, minus your standard deduction. We find that your taxable base income puts you solidly inside the 24% marginal bracket. For a married couple filing jointly, let's say the top threshold of that 24% bracket is roughly $383,900. If your base income is exactly $200,000, that means you have exactly $183,900 of empty space remaining inside the 24% container.
Before you spill over into the next bracket, and the jump from the 24% bracket to the next one, the 32% bracket, is massive. It's an 8% penalty on every dollar that spills over.
It's one of the steepest marginal cliffs in the tax code. Layer 1 dictates that you convert exactly $183,900, not a single dollar more. You fill the 24% container to the absolute brim, taking advantage of every single cent of capacity within that relatively favorable rate. If you convert $183,901, that single extra dollar is taxed at 32%. The highest level strategists treat those marginal bracket thresholds as absolute impenetrable ceilings. They project their base income with extreme precision in November or December, identify the exact amount of empty space in the most favorable bracket, and execute a conversion that fills that space down to the penny.
Okay, but this immediately raises a massive logistical question for me. We established at the start of the deep dive that we're talking about Americans sitting on IRA balances of $1 million or more. If my entire traditional IRA is worth $1.2 million and I'm only filling up these small pockets of empty space in my current tax bracket, say $100,000 one year, maybe $150,000 the next, how do I ever actually get the entire $1 million moved over before the age 73 RMD clock forces my hand? It seems like you'd run out of time and get hit by the mandate anyway.
That exact logistical challenge is why Layer 1, bracket maximization, is entirely dependent on Layer 2, which is the conversion ladder. High net worth strategists understand that converting a massive IRA is never a single event. It's a multi-year structural project. Our source material is incredibly blunt on this point. Attempting to convert $1 million all at once is considered pure financial malpractice.
If you drop $1 million of income onto your tax return in a single year, you don't just spill over into the 32% bracket, you shatter every ceiling and flood straight into the absolute highest federal tax bracket, which is currently 37%. Plus, you guarantee the absolute maximum possible IRMAA Medicare penalty we talked about earlier. You're voluntarily paying the absolute highest rates the law allows.
You're volunteering to be the IRS's best customer. Instead, the conversion ladder strategy spreads the conversion process out systematically over a period of 5 to 7 years. You architect a timeline, you look at the years leading up to the age 73 mandate, and you plan to fill those lower tax brackets year after year. Let's look at a concrete case study from the forensic files to illustrate the math. We'll call them the Smiths. The Smiths are 65 years old, they recently retired, and they have a $1.2 million traditional IRA. Their base income from a small pension and some dividends is $100,000 a year.
So they have a massive IRA, but their current taxable base income is relatively low. This is the perfect environment for a ladder.
It's the ideal window. If the Smiths execute a panic lump sum conversion of the entire $1.2 million in year one, they push nearly $900,000 of that conversion into the 37% tax bracket. The total federal tax bill on that single event would be astronomical, well over $400,000. But let's apply the 5-year conversion ladder. The Smiths look at the 24% bracket. With their $100,000 base income, they have roughly $283,000 of empty space before hitting the 32% cliff.
So in year one, they convert exactly $280,000. They pay the tax on that amount, but it's entirely capped at 24%.
Correct. And then in year two, they run the projection again, adjust for inflation indexing in the tax code, and convert another $280,000. They repeat this disciplined bracket maximizing process for 5 consecutive years. By year 5, they have successfully moved the entire $1.2 million into the tax-free Roth vault. They never once allowed a single dollar to cross into the 32% or 37% brackets.
And the source notes the exact mathematical difference here. A properly structured 5-year ladder on the Smiths' $1.2 million IRA saves them $138,000 in federal income taxes compared to doing a lump sum conversion. $138,000 of pure retained wealth just by being patient, utilizing the marginal brackets, and doing the math. That's a completely different standard of living in retirement, purely generated by structural efficiency.
And that $138,000 in savings is before we even factor in the preservation of compound interest or the avoidance of the stealth Medicare taxes, which they also successfully mitigated by keeping their MGI below the highest IRMAA tiers each year. The conversion ladder is the structural foundation of the entire Roth Extraction playbook. It dictates pace, discipline, and absolute adherence to the math. You don't let fear dictate the timeline. You let the capacity of the tax code dictate the timeline.
This is a perfect pivot back to layer 3, which fixes the very first mistake I made, the one that started this whole conversation, the internal payment trap. If the Smiths are building this incredible 5-year ladder and they're carefully maximizing their tax brackets each year to save hundreds of thousands of dollars, they still have a significant tax bill due every April for the $280,000 chunk they converted. And we already established that they absolutely cannot withhold the taxes from the IRA itself because that amputates their compound interest engine. So where does the money actually come from?
That brings us to layer 3, the core rule of ultimate wealth defense. This is the absolute golden rule that separates high net worth strategies from retail mistakes. To execute a perfect Roth conversion, you must pay the resulting tax bill using outside money.
Outside money. Let's define exactly what that means in this context, and I want to push back on it again just to make sure the listener really grasps the trade-off.
Outside money means utilizing funds that are entirely separate from your retirement accounts. You never touch the IRA itself to pay the toll. Instead, you tap into a standard taxable brokerage account. You utilize high-yield savings, a liquid emergency fund, or, if you're highly strategic, you use harvested capital gains from other investments.
So, if the Smiths generate a $60,000 tax bill in year 1 of their ladder, they are writing a check for $60,000 out of their personal checking account, or they're selling $60,000 worth of stock from their standard non-retirement brokerage account to cover the cost. They are leaving the entire $280,000 conversion amount perfectly intact to enter the Roth. But again, giving up $60,000 of liquidity is a hard pill to swallow for anyone. Psychologically, writing that check hurts.
It does hurt psychologically, which is why you have to view this through the lens of asset location rather than just taxation. Asset location is the practice of strategically deciding which accounts hold which types of investments to minimize your overall tax drag. The ultimate goal, the prime directive of this entire maneuver, is that every single dollar that enters the Roth environment must stay in the Roth environment. You endure the pain of paying the tax from your external liquid assets today because you're executing a highly calculated wealth transfer.
You're sacrificing the weak, heavily taxed money to permanently shield the strong, tax-free money.
Precisely. Let's say you use a taxable brokerage account to pay that $60,000 tax bill. That taxable account was likely generating dividends that you were paying taxes on every year, even if you were reinvesting them. It was generating capital gains. It was inefficient. By liquidating a portion of that inefficient account to pay the conversion tax, you were essentially buying a larger principal balance inside the highly efficient, completely tax-free Roth vault. Once that full $280,000 is safely locked inside the Roth, it is shielded from the IRS forever. It will compound entirely tax-free for the rest of your life, and importantly, it will not be subject to those forced RMD liquidations at age 73.
It's essentially a consolidation strategy. You're moving your net worth out of leaky buckets and pouring it entirely into a titanium vault. That completely reframes the pain of writing that tax check. You aren't losing $60,000, you're trading it for a lifetime of tax-free compounding on a much larger principal balance.
That is the exact realization that transforms a retail investor into a wealth strategist. You stop viewing the tax payment as a penalty and start viewing it as a highly leveraged investment in your own future tax-free growth.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the source material doesn't just stop at the timeless foundational rules like the ladder, marginal brackets, and outside money. It dives deep into advanced mechanics specifically designed for the upcoming tax years. We're talking about highly time-sensitive legislative changes that create massive opportunities, but only if you know exactly how to integrate them into your forward modeling. Let's move into layer 4, which the files refer to as the OBBBA senior deduction window. Now, as a reminder to the listener, we are looking at this purely through the lens of objective tax mechanics. We aren't diving into the politics of the legislation. Our job is simply to report on the math and how this law impacts your conversion architecture. So, what exactly is this window?
OBBA stands for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And looking purely at the mechanics, it introduced a temporary, highly lucrative deduction specifically targeted at individuals over the age of 65. Layer 4 focuses entirely on integrating this specific provision into your bracket maximization strategy. The Act created a $6,000 deduction per person. For a married couple filing jointly who are both over 65, that equates to a massive $12,000 deduction that can be applied directly against your income.
$12,000 of pure deduction power. And the source material stresses that this is incredibly urgent because it's a temporary window. It's not permanent tax law.
It is entirely time-bound. The legislation explicitly dictates that this senior deduction window definitively expires after the year 2028. That creates a strict, ticking countdown clock for anyone structuring a conversion ladder right now. The strategic application of this deduction is profound because it functions as an expansion of your standard deduction. If you're building your ladder and analyzing your marginal tax bracket, this $12,000 deduction directly offsets your taxable income.
So going back to the Smiths, who had that $283,000 of empty space in the 24% bracket, this deduction effectively increases that empty space. It allows them to convert an additional $12,000 from their traditional IRA to their Roth IRA without pushing their taxable income up a single cent.
Effectively, yes. They can convert that $12,000 entirely tax-free. It's the holy grail of tax planning. You're moving money from a taxable deferred environment into a permanently tax-free vault without paying a single cent at the toll booth. If you run that over the next few years until it sunsets in 2028, that's tens of thousands of dollars legally extracted from the IRS's reach at zero cost.
But are there phase-outs? The tax code loves to give you a deduction with one hand and take it away with the other if you make too much money. Does this $12,000 deduction survive if the Smiths are doing massive conversions?
That's where the architectural math is critical. There are phase-outs if your adjusted gross income climbs too high, which means you have to precisely model how much you convert to ensure you don't disqualify yourself from the very deduction you're trying to use to shield the conversion. It becomes a simultaneous equation. But as the source notes, high net worth strategists never leave free money on the table. You absolutely must factor this offset into your layer 1 bracket calculations before the 2028 sunset.
That is a phenomenal tool to have in the toolbox. But the playbook has one more defensive layer for paper assets, and it circles back to the stealth tax we discussed earlier, the IRMAA Medicare penalty. Because even if you're using OBBA to offset some taxes and you're using bracket maximization to stay in a lower federal bracket, you still have to worry about that 2-year delay triggering a massive Medicare bill. You convert $280,000, your IRMAA spikes, and 2 years later you get a $12,000 bill in the mail. How does Layer 5, the IRMAA shield, actually protect us from that 2-year look back?
The IRMAA shield requires a complete reversal of how most people view tax planning. Most people look backward. In April, they gather their W-2s and 1099s from last year to see what they owe. But because the IRMAA Medicare surcharge looks backward at your Medicare from 2 years ago to set your premiums today, the true strategist must model their income 3 years forward. You have to predict your future cash flow architecture.
3 years forward. That requires serious foresight. You're essentially playing multi-dimensional chess with your own income streams.
Precisely. The tactic here is to front-load your heaviest Roth conversions into specific years where you already know, based on your forward modeling, that your natural base income is going to drop. We call this finding your income valleys. For example, let's say you retire at age 65, but you actively decide to delay taking Social Security until age 70 to maximize your monthly benefit.
That creates a massive natural 5-year income valley where your base taxable income is incredibly low because the Social Security checks haven't started yet.
Exactly. Or perhaps you know that in 3 years, a temporary pension payout is scheduled to conclude, or you're going to finish selling off a highly taxed rental property. You intentionally execute your heaviest Roth conversions during those specific valley years, even if it spikes your MGI on paper today.
Wait, if I spike my MGI today during the valley, aren't I still going to trigger the IRMAA penalty 2 years from now?
Not necessarily, because you're executing the conversion while your base income is at its absolute lowest. By the time that 2-year delay catches up to you, the conversion event is over. and your actual base income might have stabilized. But the snapshot they took 2 years prior was taken during a period where your total combined income base plus conversion was carefully engineered to stay just underneath the IRMAA tier thresholds. You were intentionally timing the system's delay to coincide with your own deliberate income valleys.
You're shielding yourself from the delayed spikes by manipulating the timeline. You take the heavy conversion hits when you have the mathematical bandwidth to absorb them without crossing the MGI tripwires. It's purely strategic timing. But we need to transition here because the final section of our source material contains a warning that is incredibly niche but absolutely devastating if you fall into it. We spent the last 45 minutes architecting a defense for paper assets, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, cash. But what happens when the asset inside the traditional IRA has physical weight? Let's talk about the hard asset trap. Some listeners prefer physical assets. What if your traditional IRA isn't full of index funds but physical precious metals?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire U.S. tax code, including all the conversion mechanics we've discussed, is primarily designed around traditional financial instruments. When you introduce physical assets into a retirement account, you trigger a completely different set of strict forensic rules, and the penalties for ignoring them are severe. Our files issue a highly critical warning regarding IRS Section 4008 meters. If a listener holds physical gold or physical silver within their IRA, and we're talking about actual minted bars or coins, not paper ETFs that track the price of gold, the IRS applies a very specific, highly punitive classification to those assets. They are legally classified as collectibles.
Collectibles, like vintage baseball cards, rare stamps, or fine art, which means they're taxed completely differently than a share of the S&P 500.
Radically differently. For standard assets outside an IRA, long-term capital gains are usually taxed to 15 or 20%, but collectibles face a maximum capital gains rate of 28%. However, the real danger arises when you attempt to execute a Roth conversion on an IRA that contains these physical metals. If you try to move these assets incorrectly, the IRS doesn't just hit you with a capital gains tax. They treat the entire event as a fully taxable, non-compliant distribution of a collectible.
And what defines incorrectly? Because I'd assume if I want to convert my gold IRA to a Roth gold IRA, I just call the broker, or maybe I take delivery of the gold and move it to a new safe deposit box myself.
Taking personal possession of the gold is the ultimate fatal error. Under Section 408 meters, IRA-eligible precious metals must remain in the physical possession of an IRS-approved depository or custodian. You cannot touch the metals, you cannot store them in your home safe, and you cannot casually transfer them yourself. If you attempt a conversion and the transfer is not structured with absolute perfection as a direct in-kind transfer between two specifically approved custodians, the IRS treats it as a distribution.
And the penalty for that? The source material is glaring red here.
The consequences bypass standard income tax brackets completely. The IRS will immediately hit the investor with a brutal 28% collectibles tax on the full market value of the metals at the time of the flawed transfer. Furthermore, if the investor executes this flawed transfer before they reach the age of 59.5, the IRS applies an additional 10% early withdrawal penalty on top of the 28% tax.
38% of your physical wealth instantly confiscated by the government simply because the paperwork wasn't routed correctly between vaults or because you wanted to look at the gold yourself during the transition.
It proves that the IRS system heavily punishes those who react without meticulous planning. The only legal way to navigate a conversion with physical metals is the strict in-kind transfer. You don't liquidate the metals and move the cash, because that triggers unnecessary transaction fees and market timing risks. You move the physical metal from the traditional IRA custodian's vault directly to the Roth IRA custodian's vault.
But even that has strict requirements, right? The source mentions fineness and purity standards.
Yes, Section 408 meters has incredibly strict carve-outs for what types of metals are even allowed in an IRA. Gold must have a minimum fineness of 0.995, silver must be 0.999. If you somehow have non-compliant metals in the account, or if you attempt to transfer compliant metals to a receiving custodian that isn't legally authorized to hold 408-meter classified assets, the in-kind transfer fails. You must rigorously verify the fineness of the metal, and you must meticulously vet the receiving custodian. Every single ounce must be accounted for on the institutional ledger and transferred via secure, approved armored transport between the depositories before you authorize the conversion.
If you lack precision there, the extraction is ruthless. All right, we've covered an immense amount of ground today, from the psychological traps of retail investors to the most advanced multi-year forward modeling. It's time to synthesize this entire deep dive into a clear verdict for the listener. Let's bring it all together. If we distill everything we've discussed into actionable architecture, there are three absolute core pillars to the Roth extraction playbook. First, you must stop the bleeding immediately. You must never, under any circumstances, pay your conversion taxes out from the IRA itself. You have to preserve the tax-free compounding engine at all costs by utilizing outside money, sacrificing inefficient taxable assets to feed the invincible Roth vault. That's the non-negotiable foundation.
Agreed. The second pillar is to fundamentally alter your timeline. You must abandon the emotional panic conversion and embrace the conversion ladder. You treat this not as a single stressful event, but as a deliberate 5 to 7 year structural project, strictly adhering to the mathematical discipline of marginal bracket maximization. You calculate your empty space down to the dollar, you factor in the expiring $12,000 OBBA senior deduction, and you only pour what the specific bracket container can hold.
And the third pillar is to meticulously mind the stealth taxes. You have to look past the standard 1040 federal income tax and model the hidden threats. You must calculate your AMGI, adding back things like municipal bond interest, to anticipate the 2-year delay of the IRMAA Medicare surcharges using the 3-year forward-looking shield strategy. You front-load your conversions into natural income valleys. And if you're holding physical precious metals, you execute flawless institution-to-institution in-kind transfers to avoid the catastrophic 28% collectibles trap under Section 408 meter.
When you execute these three pillars perfectly, the end state you create is incredible. It's the ultimate goal of high net worth tax planning. You essentially build an impenetrable financial fortress. Your wealth is locked inside an environment where it grows entirely tax-free forever. There are absolutely no capital gains taxes to worry about when you buy and sell stocks within it. There's no tax drag on dividends. There are no forced liquidations or RMDs hanging over your head at age 73, forcing you to withdraw money you don't need. And most importantly, there is zero future IRS extraction. You have successfully opted out of the system's primary mechanism for taxing multi-generational wealth.
It's a profound shift in control.
This raises an important question for every single person listening who has a substantial balance in the traditional IRA right now. The ticking clock of the required minimum distribution is a mathematical certainty. It is coming, and it will force your hand. The question is not if you will be taxed, but how, when, and at what rate. You must actively choose whether to let the government dictate the terms of extraction at age 73, or whether you're going to take control and start building the firewall today using the strategies we've outlined. The system rewards planning, and it heavily penalizes reaction.
It's about taking the driver's seat. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder, a scenario that builds directly on the latter strategies we've discussed today, but introduces a massive variable you might not have considered regarding your legacy. Let's say you're fully convinced. You commit to the absolute optimal strategy, a carefully modeled 7-year conversion ladder to systematically move your $1 million traditional IRA into a protected Roth vault. You're executing the plan perfectly, maximizing brackets using outside money. But what happens to your estate plan if the unthinkable occurs and you pass away exactly halfway through the process, say in year 4?
That changes the math entirely for the next generation.
It does. You leave behind an estate that contains a partially converted traditional IRA and a partially funded Roth IRA. How does that split inheritance impact the tax brackets of the heirs who receive it? Under the recent Secure Act rules, non-spouse heirs who inherit a traditional IRA are generally forced to empty the entire account within 10 years. If your children inherit the remaining traditional IRA, they are now forced to pull that taxable money out during what are likely their own peak earning years. They'll be stacking your inherited IRA distributions on top of their own high salaries, potentially pushing them into the absolute highest tax brackets, compared to the absolute freedom they would have experienced if they inherited a fully converted, tax-free Roth IRA, where they could let it grow tax-free for a decade before withdrawing it without paying a dime.
It's a massive wealth transfer consideration.
Exactly. How does the architecture of your ladder today and the speed at which you convert dictate the financial reality and tax burden of your heirs tomorrow? Do you accelerate the ladder and pay slightly higher marginal rates today to guarantee your children inherit a pristine, tax-free asset? It's a complex puzzle, and it proves that wealth defense is never a static, single-generation process. It's a continuous, multi-generational strategy. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take the time to review your own structural blueprints, question the default assumptions, and ensure your wealth is protected from the extraction traps. We'll see you next time.